Today is January
15th.
15th.
Oh, wait a minute, 16th. No, it's Saturday, 15th.
Today is January 16th, 1994. I'm talking to Helen Grace Solomon, who is being interviewed by telephone. Please go ahead.
I'm an old friend of Jane Ellis Morrow Trigere, and the godmother of Janie. And I'm going to start during the war when I got a job at Food Field Reporter, and Jane Morrow, I guess she was then, I'm sure she was then, was working there. And shortly thereafter, though, because Ed Morrow was going to Spain to fight in that war, he worked on the New York Times. Somebody in the Times had gotten a very good job for Jane over at American Wool Council. And time goes by, and then a job opens up at American Wool Council, and she thought of me. And so I went over to American Wool Council and worked with her there.
Pause. What were you doing and what was she doing at the first job? What was the name of the first job?
Food Field Reporter. Food Field Reporter is a trade publication for McGraw-Hill. We actually worked in the McGraw-Hill building. And we put out a paper, came out every 2 weeks, that was published in Philadelphia. And one of the things, we were reporters, she and I. She was a senior to me. And the guy who was the editor was Roy Miller. And this paper came out every 2 weeks and printed in the Chilton Press in Philadelphia. And we had to go down there and spend one night. They'd send up the galley proofs, and we would proof them and lay them out. And then, having written this stuff too, and then we would have to go down and see it actually on the presses, and make any changes that happened to have dropped in the last minute. Okay, Food Field Reporter is just what it said. I was the packaging editor. I don't remember. I think she just had a general title and covered anything. And we all covered anything. It was a very small staff. And and this was during the war, and the government was putting out all kinds of, every week, and several times a week there would be new things that I would have to write up. But never mind, you can envision that if you're old enough to remember the war. The size of the packaging, the amount of insulation, what the outside covering would be, whether it had this drop weight or all that. You can imagine. Dull, I can tell you. Anyway, Ed, who was a wonderful man, and I think Janie knows him, or knew him, he was leaving to go to the war in Spain, and through his connections at the time, he was a reporter on the New York Times. He got Jane a job at American Wool Council, which was a trade publication, again, of the American wool growers. They were trying to promote the use of American wool as opposed to Australian wool, which is pretty fine stuff. American wool was fine, too. Crazy man by the name of Eugene Ackerman was the, I guess he would have been called the chairman. I don't think he was the president or anything like that. But anyway, he was in charge of it. And he spent a lot of time in Washington dealing with senators and growers and representatives, anyway, lobbying. He was really a lobbyist. The thing we really did was to promote American wool, okay? And to do that, we wrote stories, we took fashion photographs, we sent out releases to papers, we interviewed and had conferences with magazine editors, Vogue, Harper's, and so on. Anyway.
But pause. Would you tell me, she had one child at this time, and she was with Ed? What year are we talking?
Wait just a minute. We're talking, I think, 44.
1944. So he wasn't going to Spain because he'd done that in the 30s. This is the World War II.
No, this is World War II. Maybe he's going to World War II.
Yes. Okay.
He had gone to Spain whenever that was.
Yeah.
He was going to World War II.
So they were married and living together.
They were married and living together. They gave up an apartment that they had in, where was it? Peter Cooper, I think.
Knickerbocker Village?
Yeah, well, or Knickerbocker Village down there, one of those. Those big ones down the foot of the island.
Yeah.
There were two children, Laney and Andy, and they had a big 3-room apartment when Ed was here, and they gave it up, and she had moved into a smaller apartment to save money.
Do you remember the address?
I don't know the address. it would be some. I thought it was in Peter Cooper, but it may be Knickerbocker Village. I don't remember. I never saw the apartment until later on, and I don't think I ever wrote her a letter there. Anyway, I had a thought, and it's eluded me. But any of these thoughts will come back. Somebody has surely told you that she hated the fact that he had to be. I'm sure it was this World War II, because I remember her going down to Camp Blanding, which is down here in Florida, to see him. I can't. That thought is trying to nag at my head about what I was trying to say. Oh, you asked if there were two children. Yes, Lainey and Andy, and I don't remember how old they were, but they were pretty young. They were pretty young. I know what was nagging at me. It was because of the fashion stuff that we did for American Wool Council that she met your father, because one of the things we had to do, she did most of it, was cover the openings of the designers. And so she went to Pauline's openings and met Robert, of course, Selma, your father. And it was because of that job that she met him. You've probably been told that by everybody else. Everybody knows that. Now, all I can tell you about...
Assume nothing.
What?
Assume nothing.
What I remember about those days was that he was absolutely captivated by her, and I saw them together quite a bit.
Wait a second. She's still with Ed.
No, he's in the wars. He's gone. He's gone.
But they're not divorced.
They're not divorced.
Okay.
As far as I know. This is 40-odd years ago, long before you were born, and some of these things are a little hazy in my head. But I can remember that he was absolutely enchanted with her, and that he gave her an absolutely smashing hat. It was like a tam, an oversized tam. I wish there was a picture of it, because she looked so beautiful, and a coat that went with it from one of Pauline's collections, I guess of fall that year. I don't think she had any idea of finding another man at that point. And I don't know exactly when she and Ed were divorced. You would know that, but I don't remember that. Because she was offered a job at Milliken, and she interviewed for it and decided not to take it. Don't ask me why. And so she said to me, why don't you go over there? So I went over to Milliken, and I got the job.
What is Milliken?
Milliken Fabrics. It's one of the biggest mills in the country, biggest fashion mills. At that point, we were at 1450, I think, 7th Avenue, on the corner of 34th there on the west side and the uptown side. I don't know where. Oh, no, now I know. They're on 6th Avenue at about 40th Street in a building they built themselves. This is
Milliken.
Milliken.
Yeah.
It used to be called Deering Milliken, but that was the Deering was dropped even before Jane and I were friends. All right, so the reason I mention this and dwell on it a bit is that our paths, in a way, sort of diverged then, you see. I don't even remember how long she worked for American Wool Council or what she did right after that, because I left American Wool Council, I went to Milliken, and then I went to DuPont, and my life went off that way. But we were friends, and we kept in touch, and I knew she was seeing, and then in my job at the DuPont company, I was also covering Pauline. So we had a lot of contacts, not directly, but peripheral, shall we say. Anyway, we kept in touch, and when she and Selma decided to get married, she asked me if they could be married in my apartment, mine and Ed's, which was up at 182 North Broadway in Yonkers. And that's where they were married. I'm sure you know that. Anyway, it was a fabulous wedding. The woman who lived right next door to me, we had a great big living room with a beautiful view of the George Washington Bridge and the Hudson River. And the woman who lived right next door to me kindly vacated her apartment so that Selma and the gentleman, and anybody actually that wanted to, could go, and it was right across, the corridor, could use that apartment, which they did. And Ed, my Ed, and I don't remember who, but it must be in the record some way, I think got a judge from Yonkers, who was the guy who married them. and Pauline was there, and I think Adele Simpson, and other friends, and a man that worked for the company, Trigier, a little wonderful guy who I think was either the first pattern maker or something like that, but he was very dear and very close to them. And he was a charming man. I remember him, and I can't remember his name, of course. Anyway, the ceremony went off well, and of course, Sioma had given me a dress to wear, which I wore happily. And the only thing that will amuse you, knowing Pauline and Sioma, somebody had brought out. Well, everybody brought a lot of things. You know, I didn't put on the food. Somebody had brought out scads of caviar and chopped up onions and chopped up hard-boiled eggs, as I remember. And as you know how to serve that, they're all supposed to be served individually, you know. Well, I had really, she was a cleaning woman in the kitchen to sort of help us with all this jazz, and she mixed it all together, and it was the worst-looking glob you ever saw. And I thought Sioma was going to have a heart attack. Anyway, everything else went off very smoothly, as I remember. And I don't know where they spent their honeymoon or where they went.
Okay, let's take a break here.
All right.
Let's go back a little bit.
Okay.
Let's go back quite a bit. When you met Jane, when you were working at Food Field Reporter, were you married to Ed Solomon then?
Oh, yes. I've been married to Ed Solomon a long time.
Okay, and...
I had been married to Ed about 10 years then.
Oh.
I was married in 35.
So you had... But you didn't have your first child. He's about my age, Gray.
He's your age.
Right.
I think you're 2 weeks younger.
Right. So you didn't have your children until much later.
I was 37.
Right. So when and so she had 2 children, and you had a husband, and she had a husband who was away most of the time. So did you find yourself sometimes going out for an evening together or something?
No, we never did.
So did you ever do any kind of entertaining together?
Not that I know of. Not that I know. We went to lunch together. And there was a marvelous guy who appeared one day. I can't remember his name. Big blonde sailor. He was a sailor. I can see him now. And Jane and I and this guy went down to Longchamps. We were on where were we? It was close to Times Square. But anyway, at the Food Field Reporter office, we went down to that Longchamps, which was. It seems to me it would be like. Oh, it doesn't matter. It would be like 45th or 46th Street, I think. And Broadway, and we had a marvelous time together. But as for, I never went to dinner in her apartment downtown, and I never entertained her up there, and I never entertained her and Sioma. But we went to professional parties together. If Milliken gave a big party, we would always be there, all of us.
Uh-huh.
I mean, Sioma and Jane and I. As 3 individuals, see, she was working whatever she was doing, I was working whatever I was doing, and he was doing. But we were friends in a sort of a non-intimate way, if you can imagine.
So you wouldn't have heard her speak about her intention to divorce Ed Morrow? I
have no recollection of Ed Morrow and why they were divorced.
But did you know him a little bit?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I knew him a little bit, and I liked him. And don't ask me why. And of course, I met him at your wedding.
That must have been strange.
No,
it occurs to me.
Was it strange to you?
No, but it occurs to me now.
No, it was very easy. In fact, I knew him better than, well, your brother was there, Andy, and of course I knew Pauline and Sioma, and you and Larry, but I knew Ed probably Ed Morrow. You knew him quite well, didn't you, Jane?
Oh, yes.
And I always liked him. I always thought he was a splendid man.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, and next, another point. At this wedding...
Yes? You knew they were married in my apartment,
That I knew.
Yeah.
Were any of her family there?
No. No.
Did she ever share with you any of...
I met her
any
mother
thoughts
once.
on this?
Do you know that she tried to kill... that Jane, your mother, tried to kill herself once?
No.
You don't know that? Well, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but she did, in fact, and that was when I met her mother. I never met her mother until then. It was it was when we were working at American Wool Council, and Ed had gone, and she was living in this apartment which she didn't like, the smaller apartment, and I think life just closed in on her. I don't know what the other, that's all I know is that Ed was gone, and she moved into this place, and I don't think she really liked her job, and it was a real down. She slit her wrists. I don't think it was a real suicide in the sense that help was gotten. And at this point, I don't know whether she called or whether Andy called. Andy ought to know about this, but or a neighbor or what. But she was called, and I mean, she was found, and then she spent at least a month, maybe 6 weeks, whatever the. There's a law in New York that if you make an attempted suicide, you have to be under surveillance for X number of weeks. And she stayed in this place out on, I think it was Long Island. Isn't that awful? Like, well, this is the sort of thing you try to put out of your mind, I guess. I went out to see her, and her mother came, and I saw. That's when I met your grandmother, Mrs. Ellis. I can't think what we called her. I don't even know what her first name is, but you must have that somewhere.
Her first name is Janie.
No, I didn't call her Janie. I guess I just called her Mrs. Ellis. But Jane and old Eugene Ackerman, who was a bastard, he was, as I say, whatever his title was at American Wool Council. I think he handled himself very well in all that, because a lot of in those days, you know, you didn't have much job security. I think he could have fired her if he'd wanted to. He didn't, and he got temporary help, and I did a lot of work that she would have been doing. And there was another little girl in there. I can see her face, but I can't remember her name.
Can you put a year to this?
Yeah, let me think. Let me think. I really got to go back, and I hope it won't take too much time.
I got plenty of tape.
Okay, good. Now, wait just a minute. I've got to think.
Think out loud.
I went to DuPont in 30, it must have been 36. I mean 46. Because Gray, because I went there in September, and he was born in 48, and I got pregnant so that he was born in November of 48. So I went there in 37, and I had spent a whole year in Milliken, which would put us back to 46. This was probably in, it could have been before the war was over, or it could have been right after the war was over. So it's in, let's say, 45 or 46.
Uh-huh.
Okay? Does that tie in with any other dates?
No.
Well, anyway, Eugene Ackerman held her job for her, and we all pitched in, and eventually she came back. And then just about the time she came back, I went off to the Milliken job, you see. She'd had the interview with the Milliken job, as my recollection is, before she cut her wrists.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
So there was no one from her family at this wedding?
Not that I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I remember.
Okay, so after
who would have come? I'm sure her mother wasn't there, because I would remember her. And she didn't have any sisters.
She had a brother.
I don't think I ever met the brother.
And she had her father and her mother.
I don't. I'm pretty sure there was nobody from the wedding, from the family there.
Mm-hmm. What do you have any recollections in all your chatter of young women working together?
Yes.
About her, her early experience in coming to the North, or college at Barnard, where she had not finished her studies?
I think she graduated from Barnard.
No, she didn't at that time.
Oh, she didn't get her degree then?
No, she actually got her degree when I was in high school.
Well, I knew she'd gone to Barnard, but I don't remember any of that chatter. You know, that kind of chatter goes in and out.
Mm-hmm.
She had a vicious tongue. I can remember that. Has anybody else told you that?
I could tell you that.
She had a tendency to put people down. She used to make me so mad I'd almost cry. But I don't think I ever cried in front of her. I may have, who knows. But she also had a sparkling wit, always a little acerbic, but delightful if it wasn't being barbed at you, you know. Anyway, I don't remember any tales about her Barnard days. I don't remember her talking about a roommate or how she lived or where she lived, whether she lived on campus or any of that. I just knew she went to Barnard.
Did young working women, married working women in those days, speak of their family life and husbands?
I don't believe so. You mean our sex life or something like that?
No, not sex particularly, but just, you know, your life together, troubles at home, difficulties with the kids.
I know that she hated the fact that Ed went off, and I don't. My recollection of all of that stuff was that it was a good thing that had been ruined by his having to go.
So let's go back to the wedding. From then on, you take it chronologically.
Yeah, okay.
They moved up near you. No, who moved up to Bronxville
I was up
first?
in Yonkers, you see. And then they lived for a year down in that fabulous apartment on Central Park West. Did anybody ever
Central Park South.
South, Central Park South.
Mm-hmm.
I've been there, and it was lovely. Sioma designed it, and every inch that could be used for closet or cupboard was used, and yet it was fairly spacious looking.
Did they move into that apartment? Were they the first people in that family to move into that apartment?
You mean yes, as far as I know.
Because my grandmother moved in there afterwards. And
Alice?
No, my father's mother.
Grandmother.
Yeah. And the apartments that they had tended to be handed down from one family member to the next.
Well, maybe this was an old one that was handed down and Sioma just did it over. I only saw the one apartment, and it had been newly done, and it was just divine.
How did you know that he had designed it?
I don't know. I don't have it written down anyplace, but it was just in my head that he designed it.
Mm-hmm.
And my recollection is that out of this tiny space, they had achieved 2 little rooms, one for Andy and one for Laney. Do those two ever remember living there?
Well, it really is a one-bedroom apartment.
It's just tiny, tiny.
With a very large living room.
That's right.
And a small kitchenette.
I don't remember the kitchen.
And is there a step going down to the living room?
I don't remember that either. I just remember how lovely it looked and that there was enough space for all of them. And it seems to me I saw where there have been bunk beds in a little tiny, like a dressing room or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. But I'm sure they were all living there, because where else would the children have gone? See, I don't know what happened to Ed at that time. They were obviously divorced, or they wouldn't have been married, but I don't know. I'm sorry there's so many holes in this thing.
Mm-hmm,
But,
well, I know they were married in June of 47.
June of 47. That sounds all right to me. I was working for Milliken at that time, and I went to work for DuPont in September of 47, and then Gray was born in November of 48.
Mm-hmm.
So that sounds okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, then next, my recollection is that they had this house in Hastings.
Now, the address that you give in Yonkers, is that the house near Sarah Lawrence?
No. This is over on the river. 182 North Broadway is... it's near St. John's Riverside Hospital, and it's up on the bluffs. It looked out over the Hudson, and we could see the George Washington Bridge.
So when did you move to Bronxville?
We moved to Bronxville in... well, Gray was about a year old, so that would be like 49. Because he was born in St. John's Riverside Hospital and came back to that apartment.
Why did you move to Bronxville?
Because we didn't have enough room to have a live-in maid, and I was working, and it was just too horrendous to have to rely on.
And Ed was doing what? Ed Solomon?
Ed Solomon was teaching at Sarah Lawrence. That's the reason we were living in Bronxville, is because he left the service to take a job at Sarah Lawrence.
What was he teaching?
Sociology,
Mm-hmm.
and he was also director of field work.
Mm-hmm. So did you see each other when you both lived in Westchester?
Say it again?
Did you see each other when you lived in Westchester?
Yes.
Socializing?
Say it again?
Did you socialize in those days?
We went back and forth because we were both pregnant. You see, you two were born just a couple of weeks apart. Gray was born on the 8th. Weren't you born like on the 16th?
28th.
All right,
29th.
All right, well, he was born on the 8th of November. And we spent a considerable time together during the days, but if you call socializing, you know, barbecues in the backyard, that sort of thing, we didn't do that. I think I went to one party that was a sort of a professional party that Jane put on for Selma there, and that house had a lovely back terrace. Do you remember that? No, you didn't live there very much.
Tell me about the house. Tell me how do you know how they chose that house?
No, I don't know, but it was...
Do you know what Jane felt about the house?
Jane?
Yes.
She liked it. As far as I know, it was a big sort of a Tudor, you know, with brick and stucco and exposed beams on the outside. You know the kind when I say Tudor, don't you?
Yeah.
And big two-story, and it was built on the side of a hill, and there was a terrace, open terrace, at either end of this long living room that was on in my image, the right-hand side of the house. And this party that Ed and I went to, that he gave for colleagues for some reason, I think it was after Gray was born and after you were born. How long did they live in that house after you were born? Can you remember?
Not very long.
Well, you see, my image, I lose a lot in here. The next real image I have of you all is Jane going to France when you were a little girl, like maybe 2.
Okay, now this is where I'm missing information. Now they were obviously not getting along, and they've decided to separate. The idea to send his wife and the 3 children to France is interesting.
Well, I think it had something to do with that they were going to try and live apart for a little while and see if they could straighten out their differences. That's that's the image that I remember.
What I'm curious about is if the 2 of you were friends, did you talk about what was going on?
No, we were friends, but we did not talk about that stuff. I'm a pretty in those days, I was a pretty reserved lady. I was not apt to talk about any problems that I might have, and I have a feeling that Jane was pretty reserved too.
Well, I have no problem understanding that. I was the same way.
As you get older, you can talk about things more easily.
Right.
But when you first confront a problem, it seems like it's only yours, you know.
Yeah.
And you don't realize everybody has the same
So
problem.
did it seem a tremendous surprise when all of a sudden they were closing the house and she was going to France?
Yes, because I hadn't been close to them. I was, how old were you when you went? Were you 2?
I think 17 months.
Because I have an image of when they were split, and I don't know whether they were still living in, theoretically living in Hastings, of Selma bringing you as like a year and a half over to our house, which was on Chatfield Road, which was from the apartment we left to Chatfield. We went to Chatfield Road, and then we went to Normandy Terrace, where the picture of you and me and Gray was taken.
Right.
There was a house in between that we lived in from 49 to 55.
So Selma brought me over to visit you?
He brought you over many Sundays.
Just him and me?
Just the 2 of you.
Didn't that seem a little odd?
Well, they were separated or unhappily. I think Jane was still living in Hastings, and he would come out to see you, and he would bring you over.
Oh, I see. Well, that would make sense.
I'm pretty sure that's the way it was.
Uh-huh.
And he never had a car, as far as I know. He was always in a hired car, which we always thought was so funny.
Oh, because he lived in the city?
He lived in the city, yes.
Uh-huh.
I don't think they even had a car when they really lived in Hastings. Selma's idea was that hire a car whenever you need one, and when you don't need one, don't be paying insurance and all that jazzy stuff on it.
Uh-huh.
Did you ever hear him say that?
No.
Well, I've heard him expound on that. Why, anybody owns a car in this town, he would say.
Uh-huh. Well, he has a point, I guess, but
Oh,
he didn't
yes.
keep to it.
Well,
he ended up with
he lived in the city, and the parties they would be going to would be in Manhattan mostly.
Uh-huh.
And why do you need a car? You take a taxi. Otherwise, and garaging has always been a problem in the city. You know?
Uh-huh, right.
All right, well, no, I never heard anything derogatory about Selma and their relationship from Jane. And I
So, with nothing being discussed casually and not on intimate terms, so she would be telling you how she was feeling and how she was upset or whatever.
No,
the next thing you knew, she was going off to France.
That's right. And I was mightily surprised. And the two reasons that swim around in my head was that Sioma wanted the children to have exposure to France and the French language, and you especially, and that they had been having troubles and they wanted to live apart for a little while and see how that was. And I don't know what happened when they came back. I don't know whether they ever lived together again or not, because I just lost a whole lot of that, you know. Life changes.
Well, when did I can fill you in if you want, but not on this tape. It's not the point.
No.
When did you pick up again, if ever?
Well, only sort of spasmodically. I went to the night my father died. Believe it or not, we were at Jane's and the Admiral's out in New Jersey, and they tracked me down over there. We were spending the weekend. You met the Admiral?
Oh, yes. Well, that's many, many, many years later.
Oh, many, 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 many years later.
Did you keep in touch by mail?
No, we didn't really keep in touch for all long stretches.
Did you ever write to her in France?
I never wrote to her in France.
Did you ever write to her in Argentina?
I never wrote to her in Argentina.
Did she ever write to you during those times?
I think I got like Christmas cards.
So the next time you had contact was when she was living again with Ed in New Jersey?
With Ed, but I can't even remember where. But she married Ed again, didn't she?
She married Ed in Paris in 1951. October.
51. Let's see, Gray would have been only 4 years old. Well, I just lost track of them for a long, long time.
Did you ever visit them in New Jersey?
Never visited them in New Jersey.
Did she ever come to you in New York?
Not that I know of, except maybe to have lunch together one day. But
then she went when in the first half of the 60s. I was in high school. I left my mother's home. I went to live in New York with my father, and at this point, she took an apartment in the Upper West Side, where you were living at this point, and she went back to Columbia General Studies to finish her undergraduate degree and her master's. Did you meet her then?
I don't think our paths crossed then. I don't remember that. The next, chronologically, actually the next thing I remember is Sioma saying that you wanted to go to Sarah Lawrence. And he talked to Ed. He didn't talk to me, because Ed was the guy who was at Sarah Lawrence, you see. And wanted to know what to do, whether we needed to get any special letters or anything like that. But you had no trouble getting in. You were a good student. Where did you go to high school?
I went to the Lycée Français in New York.
Oh, yes, I remember that now. I remember that.
And I remember that when I got in, I mean, he had wonderful things to say about Sarah Lawrence. And I applied 1 year early from high school.
Yes.
And I didn't apply anyplace else. And when I got in, he said to me, well, it wasn't such a great school.
Who, Ed said that?
No, Sioma.
Oh, he said that to you?
Yeah.
What do you mean, that was his judgment, or the fact that they took you in, or what? What was that based on?
Nothing.
Well, that was a funny thing to say.
Yeah, well.
It was a fine school. Didn't you think it was a fine school?
Yeah, I had a little difficulty with it because the French school that I came from never trained me to make my own choices about anything.
Yeah, they just told you.
Yeah, and so and Sarah Lawrence was all about taking choices and taking responsibility for yourself. That was a hard thing for me to cope with, but I loved it.
Yeah. Well, and then I forget what year you were in, but and I don't even remember this, but the why of this. But I do remember that we had. Oh, I know why it was. Sabine Abel's cousin was over in the United States, and she had written us. I heard from Sabine not too long ago. Sabine had written us and said, please entertain my cousin. And we entertained, and we had you and Larry and Bobby Cook, I think. Is that right? Ring a bell?
I don't know the name of the other boy.
But there were about 6 of you, weren't there?
4.
No, there must have been 6. There was Larry and you and the cousin.
And then another young man.
It wasn't Gray, huh?
No, it wasn't Gray.
Oh, it was Bobby Cook then, because Bobby Cook is what pops into mind. And you had dinner with us, and then you went out on the town, right?
You sent us out on the town.
Well, Ed gave us $20 or something.
Right.
We thought that's what you ought to do. Well, we wanted this girl to see whatever she was supposed to see in New York. And I think Ed had kept up with you at Sarah Lawrence, but I hadn't much. I may have known that you were there, but that was about it. And
because by that time you'd moved back into the city.
oh, we were back in the city. That dinner party we gave it at 54 Morningside Drive,
Right.
which is up near Columbia. But when Jane was going, see, I didn't even realize that she hadn't graduated from Barnard. When Jane was going back to school, and we were living up there, I guess. We moved up there in '66. When did she go back to school?
In '66 I went to Sarah Lawrence, so this must have been like 63, 64, 65.
And she went back to school.
Yeah.
Well,
Let me just stop a second here.
What?
I'm going to stop a second, just
Okay.
a minute. Now, does anything that I've just said spark any memories for you?
Am I on yet?
Yep, you're on.
I vaguely remember something about the divorce, and heaven help me, I sort of think it was Florida, but I don't know where, because I think in those days you could get a divorce in Florida like in 6 weeks or something. But you're right. It was. I can hear her talking to me now, saying, "All you have to do is get a library card and an electric light bill, or 2 dumb pieces of paper that establish that you are a resident there." But I don't know whether.
When was she telling you this?
Where?
When?
I don't remember exactly, but I just when you say that she got the divorce in some unusual place, I remember. I just sort of remember her saying that all you had to have was a light bill and a library card, which we both laughed over that for some reason. Don't ask me why, but I have that image. Maybe we were having lunch together. Maybe that was one of the few times we did meet. You know.
Uh-huh.
And you were what? About when? About how old?
51. I would have been 3.
Yeah. Well, I don't remember. But you're talking about coming back and visiting your father. Did anybody tell you that you went from New York once with your French nanny, an older woman, all the way to Richmond to visit the Ellises?
Do you remember this?
I was told about this and how wonderful you were. She didn't speak a word of English, and you were about 4 or 5 years old. And it seems to me you had to either take a Pullman car or it was a long trip, and that you dealt with the porter and with the baggage man and everything like that. And you were just tiny, 4 or 5 years old. Did anybody ever tell you that story?
Well, no, but what's peculiar is that I didn't speak English then.
Well,
So that doesn't quite work.
No, it doesn't.
I think that's a little later, because I did visit them when I was probably 6 or 7. So that would make
you
sense.
come over with a French nanny?
Oh yeah, she stayed with me until I was 8.
Because I could be wrong on your age.
Yeah,
but, the story was that you handled the English and she didn't speak a word.
Uh-huh. That would be later, yes.
Yeah, and they were still alive then. Wasn't it Richmond?
Yeah, they lived until their 90s.
Uh-huh.
So what? If you look back over time, who did you end up staying friends with along?
We stayed friends with both of them. I stayed friends with Cioma, and I may have seen him more than I saw Jane because I was working in the fashion business for the DuPont Company, and I went to Pauline's showings. So I saw him twice a year there if I never saw him any other place, you know.
Uh-huh. Can you tell me your impressions of Trigère at the time?
Oh, it was a fabulous house. Very good. And we were always trying to get Pauline to use the synthetic fibers, fabrics with the synthetic fibers. And she was always 100% wool or 100% silk or 100% cotton girl, you know. I don't know what she's using now, but although she has appeared in DuPont ads in the fashion magazines, she would design something that was made by a good mill, a good French mill probably, because we did have a lot of fibers in the French mills.
And somebody from DuPont is responsible for getting her to do this.
That, yeah, but see, that would have been somebody in the promotion or the sales department, and then after it was accomplished, then we would take publicity photographs to send out to the magazines and to the newspapers, and somebody in the advertising department would take photographs to put in the ads. But I didn't have anything to do with placing the fabrics and getting Pauline to use them.
Okay, there's another subject that I wanted to ask about, so now that we're back into the fashion industry.
Yes.
And that has to do with the company, the family company. And as a person in the industry but outside 7th Avenue, your impressions of how that company was run in terms of the partnership between Pauline and Sioma. Did you have any? Could you pick up anything on that?
Only very shadowy. She was obviously the designer and the head honcho, but he was the one. Everybody thought that I knew, whether we talked in these specific terms or not. He was the one that got things done. In other words, this little man that I'm talking about that was at the wedding, that was the first cutter or whatever, the first pattern maker. Sioma was the one who did all that, and he was the one who managed the money. In other words, Pauline would see this fabulous fabric, and Robert would say, Sioma would say, oh, we can't afford that, or something like that. In other words, he was the money man, and she was the artiste.
Uh-huh. And did you pick up then anything of friction between them?
Pauline and Robert?
Yeah.
Nothing more than you would expect from two sort of headstrong people who are at the top of a very complicated business.
Okay, so tell me, how is Sioma headstrong?
How is Sioma headstrong?
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe stubborn is a better word.
Mm-hmm.
He was absolutely immovable in anything. If he took a position, Jane or Pauline or anybody could just beat around like sea around Gibraltar, and he never changed his mind.
How do you know that about Pauline?
I can't give you chapter and verse. I can just tell you that that was sort of brooded about, you know.
In the industry?
In the industry. And I didn't know all those many people in the industry. I knew other publicity people, other fabric people, other fiber people. I didn't know too many. I didn't know designers themselves very well.
Mm-hmm.
You with me?
Yeah. The I'm going to stop this a second.
Isn't that right? Oh, well, she'd been in
Bendel's.
What?
Bendel's.
All right, Bendel's. It was a big department store, and that she was a lovely lady, tall and willowy like your mother, and I don't know how your mother looked in the last years of her life. I can't remember the last time I saw her, which was because that was such a terrible night, you know, the night that I got called and told my father died. I really can't even see the Admiral, what he looked like. But anyway, Gunn was supposed to be less spiky than Jane, and very fashion conscious and well put together, that sort of stuff. And that they moved to California because Robert wanted to change the scene, and so did she. They were both fed up with the New York scene. I don't know.
Where did you pick all that up?
Oh, you know, you go to lunch with people who are in the business, and somebody is talking about one aspect, and you just pick this up.
Uh-huh. You mean people did not talk about the fact that Pauline and Sioma broke up?
Not specifically to me that I remember.
Was that bandied about in the business, on the street?
I just don't know, because you see, unless a designer was using things of DuPont, unless she was using, say, Orlon or Dacron or Kiana or any of our fibers, I really had very little to do with them, because I only got into the act after they had placed the fabric and it was going to be cut and going to be on the line. Then I would get in the act to take publicity photos, you see.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The advertising people would be the first ones in, because anything that Pauline designed in our fibers would have been candidates for ads, because she was top of the heap.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't use very much of our stuff. So while I was always invited to the showings, I really never took very many pictures of Pauline's clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would just not be something that I would hear about, and I don't remember hearing anything about it.
Well, they split up. Sioma left in tremendous anger.
Oh, they did?
In about 1973, I guess. But in fact, this was, from what I gather in the papers I see, and a little bit I glean here and there, this is really a quarrel that had been going on since 1953 or 4. So for about 20 years, tremendous strain between them.
Well, the only thing I can remember, speaking of strains, Sioma had 2 sons, didn't she?
Pauline had 2 sons.
Who?
Pauline.
Yeah, Pauline had 2 sons, and I don't know, they were both brought into the business from one time or another, or one of them was in there for a long time, and this is, you know, just stuff I absorbed through the pores. Sioma and that boy didn't get along worth a damn.
Right, correct. Now, do you remember them and Pauline when, way back, by the time you got to know Sioma, at the very beginning when you got to know Sioma, did you know anything about those 2 boys?
No.
No.
Sioma and Pauline were the only people there when I first heard about Pauline Trigère, the line. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me it was some years later from when I first knew about them that the boys came on the scene.
Oh, well, yeah, well, they would be too young.
Yeah.
No, I was just trying to see if you knew anything of his relationship to them, because he was sort of like a substitute father. Their father left.
No,
well, I don't know when
anything
exactly.
About that. I didn't know him that well.
Okay.
I don't even know, unless one of them is named Jean-Claude or something like that.
Jean-Pierre is the one who's in the business now, and he's the one that Sioma left. He was the one, the cause. Oh. Presumably the cause. I think it's just a...
Well, it's just sort of a natural assumption that people would make from not knowing very much. You know, the son of the main star of the organization, and then the brother who really does all the work. You see, that was sort of that phrase really captures what most people said, was that Pauline was the star. She had these wonderful ideas, but it was Robert that did all the work. He got the fabrics delivered, he got the things cut, he got the things made, he got the sales made. You know, he was the one who really did it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And he went to the West Coast then. You knew Ian Gunn went to the West Coast.
Yeah.
And I've forgotten. I think she worked for Giorgio or somebody like that on Rodeo Drive, some good house on Rodeo Drive. And
no, they opened up their own business.
Oh, they did? See, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, and he decided to go to retail, which was an awful mistake. And he got ill and had Alzheimer's. And
oh, he did?
We don't know how long, really, he had it. And she just kept it together until he died, and then shortly thereafter they had a Chapter 11.
Oh,
and
bless his heart.
And
he was a lovely man. I don't know how your memory of him is, but he was very courtly and very, very lovely. I always was very fond of him.
Well, I'll tell you, so I know that part of him, and I know many, many people who speak of this gentle, elegant European man.
Yes.
And he was I also knew his tremendous anger and his stubbornness.
Yeah, well, he was,
and he had a tendency to remember the wrongs done to him for a long time.
Yeah, well, see, I don't remember that, but I just remember that stubbornness. And don't ask me why I know that, but I do. Maybe it's tales that Jane told me that are now gone, or.
Well, in the same vein, what do you remember of Jane?
Of Jane?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mentioned that she had a viper's tongue. She had no sense of people's feelings or how sharp her comments were from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Was it fun being her friend? Sounds like it could have been a little hard.
It was sort of, good patches and bad patches. She was smart as hell. She wrote very well. In the jobs that I worked with her, she was always able to cope with what she was doing. And she was not basically a friendly person. I can't really explain that.
Warm.
She was not warm, but she was bright and witty and gay, and I don't mean a party girl in the sense that she was loose or anything like that, but she was at her best when there was a sort of a crowd around, even if it was only 8 people for dinner, and she was
performing.
Yeah, and she was witty, and she was clever, and she was, but every now and then there was that she would say something that would really hurt somebody,
Okay, let me ask you about something that was part of the culture of the 40s and 50s, and that is drinking.
Drinking?
Yeah,
alcohol.
alcohol.
We all drank a lot.
Yeah. Now,
but I don't remember her drinking to excess.
No.
No. Although
Because
I
all of
don't
us...
remember her drinking to excess ever. The only thing we ever did in that connection that we would sometimes after work go down to that same Longshops that I mentioned earlier and have a drink. But usually it was just one drink, and then we'd separate and go our separate ways. She'd go downtown, and I'd go up.
Who was taking care of her kids? Do you know that?
No.
No.
Don't know. But you lived, they lived, you weren't born yet. They lived down there. You say Knickerbocker Village. Is that next to Peter Cooper?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was down that way. I don't know who was taking care of them, what school they were going to, or anything about that.
Uh-huh.
No.
It's funny, is this really part of the... I mean, nowadays, if we were discussing this kind of thing, I think I would know the child care problems or difficulties of a coworker. These things were not discussed. This was something you had to take care of on your own, and it was not something you had to...
Or you didn't talk about. See, I had lived... Well, I didn't have any children when I knew Jane.
That's right.
Intimately. But when I went to work for DuPont, after Gray was... Well, I worked for DuPont when Gray was born. But I had a live-in help, and you just didn't talk about it because it was between you and your live-in help, you know. It
That's
wasn't
right.
like I was having to get a new girl every week.
Right.
Or to drop him off at a place or anything. It was
Yeah.
a different kind of a...
But she must have been having a hard time.
well, I think that was maybe one of the reasons she cut her wrists at that time.
Yeah, maybe
I don't know.
Ed was... Maybe they were planning a divorce at that time.
She and Ed Morrow?
Yeah.
My image is that he was off in the wars. That he had gone and had left her with all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, taking care of the two kids, and she hated that smaller apartment. That's about the only thing that I remember vividly that she talked about. She didn't have enough room, and it was, you know, it was just a mess.
I mean, how much money would she have been earning? Was she okay financially?
I don't know how much she made. I know she made more than I did, and I don't know how much I made, if you want to know the truth. But we were making adequate. Let me think. We were probably, well, now you know, you can't relate this to today's world.
Right, of course.
It seems to me that I was making less than $100 a week, and that when I went to Milliken, I made $100 a week. That would be $400 a month, and that
one could live on this.
Well, you had to have two incomes, and Ed was probably sending money home from the wars, wasn't he?
Right.
I don't know how much he made, but he was not a shave tail or anything like that. He was a captain, wasn't he?
I don't know.
I don't either. Ed was a second lieutenant, and he had a little money, and we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together for anything but the bare bones of living, you know.
So he was in the Army too, your Ed?
No, Ed was in the Maritime Service.
Your Ed?
My Ed was in the Maritime Service.
Uh-huh. So he was away also?
Well, he was away in the sense that he was not living at home all the time, but he never got more than 10 miles away from Times Square. He was out on Governor's Island, which is in the lower bay, you know,
Yeah.
up beyond the Statue of Liberty,
Yeah.
to the left toward Brooklyn. And out on Long Island in, what was the name of that town? It was in, it was on the Con Estate. It was out on Long Island anyway. And then eventually he was stationed on 44th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue, and we lived at the Royal Hotel. He only had to walk half a block to get to work.
That's nice.
Oh, it was nice. He hated it. He wanted to go to sea, of course,
Ah.
but he never got to sea. And I'm just as glad he never got to sea. Because those were in the days of the Murmansk Run, which you probably never even heard of. But they were trying to get supplies into Russia through the very top, just cold to cold up to Murmansk. And they had to go through right by Germany, you see, and only about half those ships ever got through. And I can't tell you how many friends we knew who were in the bottom of the sea in those years. And I was so glad that he never got shipped out, but that's what he wanted. They always want to be right where the worst is, you know.
Uh-huh.
Well, anyway, those days are gone. Thank you.
Well,
Let me see if there was anything. I didn't make any notes because I couldn't figure out what you might want to know. You know, but she was, one of the reasons we kept up through the years from my standpoint is that she was important in my life because she really got me on the track that finally put me where I had the best job I ever had. You see, I met her at Food Field Reporter, and she went to American Wool Council, and she brought me over to American Wool Council. Then she didn't take the job at Milliken, and I got that job, and then because of being at Milliken, I got my DuPont job, and that's where I stayed for 30 years. So she was always important in my life. And I guess I was important in her life, although the fact that she asked me to be a godmother might have been a way of getting back at Seoma, because I'm not sure that he wanted her to be, you to be christened. I just sort of got that feeling. Never anything overtly said, you know. But you were, in fact, christened in that little church. Is it in Hastings? I guess it was in Hastings. I can sort of see that little church now. And Ed and I, of course, were there, and I don't remember.
Was Seoma there, too?
I can't remember. I don't remember Seoma being there.
I think that's a hard thing to have happened, but he was, I think, on one level, I think that this was perhaps an ideal. This was his second generation assimilation into American mainstream culture.
Yeah.
Many immigrants did it this way. If they couldn't do it themselves, they would do it through their children.
That's right. That's right.
And his interest in things Jewish was certainly not a high priority at all. In fact, the message I got was, when I was younger, was that this was something that was not to be broadcast and not to be particularly proud of. And much of the research that I'm trying to do now is really into the 1920s, trying to figure out who these people were way back in Paris. Their parents, they did not celebrate any Jewish holidays, except perhaps Yom Kippur.
Originally, I think, Janie.
Yeah, they were Russian, but in France is when they were being raised, and neither one of them remembers holidays being celebrated, although my grandmother once, I remember one year being at her Passover Seder. So these were my grandparents were non-religious Jews coming from Russia, and they raised their children to be part of mainstream France.
Yeah. Well, you see, my image of the couture when Pauline was probably learning an apprentice, it wasn't a lot. There weren't many Jewish people in it. There were a lot of, well, you remember, Balenciaga was Spanish, and there was a man by the name of Jacques Fat who was.
But this is in France.
This is in France, yes.
Right, right. Both in Europe, both in France and in America, the people who worked in the industry were thousands and thousands of Russian tailors.
That's right.
But the top of the designers, you're right, were not particularly Jewish.
No.
Right. So I mean, Europe is a different. Europe and America in the 40s and 50s also. Jewishness was not something you talked about. It was best left unsaid, if anything. And so that's the culture he brought with himself. So this was his way of assimilating. So I think on one level he was perfectly happy. Perhaps on another gut level, more primitive, further deep inside, it probably disturbed him. But I never discussed it with him, frankly, so I don't know that.
Yeah.
So you were there, actually, but you don't know either, really.
I don't know either.
No.
But now when you were...
When I came to New York, my mother, who had always told me I was Jewish, but still we had Christmas trees and stuff like that. And when she came back to America from Argentina, she decided at some point that she was going to become religious, and so she started taking us all to church all the time, Laney and me. Andy was already out of the house, and she had us confirmed in an Episcopal church. And once again, I remember my father coming to some ceremony. When I came to, nevertheless, she used to tell me I was Jewish. When I came to New York, and there were so many Jews around me, it was much easier to identify as a Jew, even though I knew nothing. And my first experience of identifying and acting as a Jew was in fact to play hooky from school on the days that I knew the other Jewish students would be away because it was a Jewish holiday.
Yeah,
there was
advantage.
Well, there was nothing to do at home because there was nothing being celebrated there. So I would get on the bus and go to the 42nd Street Library and roam around there for a while.
Well, where were you living then?
That was in 5th Avenue and 95th.
Oh yeah, I don't think I was ever in that apartment, but why did I know that you lived at 5th Avenue and 95th? I don't know, but maybe I picked Chioma. We picked Chioma up there.
Then from there I went to college. At college I hooked up with a rabbi from Yonkers, and I took courses with him, and I told him I wanted to convert. I wanted to be Jewish officially. And I did that. And no one in my Jewish side of the family quite understood why I'd done that, because they weren't particularly interested in their own traditions. My mother must have been hurt at some level. We only talked about it very briefly. I think she appreciated the fact that I was interested and observant and was observant to a certain degree, let's put it that way, and that I was raising my child with certain religious traditions. She liked that, whereas her other grandchildren were not.
And who's got children, Lainey?
Lainey and Andy both. So I would send Sarah, my firstborn, to visit with her for a weekend, and Rachel was going then. Sarah was going then to a religious day school, and she had her little prayers to say, and my mother would help her say them. And Andrew was an elegant person about all of this. We came to visit for a weekend, and he would say, "Now I know you observe the Sabbath, and I want to do what I can to make it nice for you. So tell me what I can do," like that. But we talked earlier about alcohol. Alcohol had become a real immense part of her life, and had, in fact, through my younger years, most children are not aware of why their parents are behaving a certain way if it has to do with alcohol. There's no one's telling them, "Oh, this is alcohol-induced, this is not because of you," or "This is not because of anything. This is because the person has drunk too much. That's why they're behaving erratically." A kid doesn't know this and is always we all three of us were always ready for the unexpected.
Because she was drinking when you were just a little girl?
Well, we don't really know when it started. Maybe it was down in Argentina, where a lot of partying and a lot of social drinking was part of it.
Ed Morrow was down there.
Yeah. By the time I remember more accurately in New Jersey, their drinking culture was really well ensconced. But I think if you ask any of the three children, they will all say that both Ed and Jane were alcoholics. I think both Ed and Jane would deny that, but that's not unusual. Alcoholics deny that.
Well, there was a lot of drinking, I'm trying to remember when it was that Ed and I and everybody we knew, everybody was drinking too much. Now, some of them turned out to be alcoholics and some of them didn't. It would have been, it seems to me, in the 50s. Would that jive with when you remember them drinking a lot? In the 50s.
In the 50s, I think that doesn't quite work. Listen, 50s, when you knew them in the 50s, you knew Ed and Jane.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about that it was just general through the culture. Ed, Solomon, and me, and our friends. That
was really, all you have to do is, for anybody who hasn't lived through it, all you have to do is look at the movies of the period. I mean, nobody gets away with acting a scene without a glass of alcohol and a cigarette in their hand.
That's
right. It was really part of the culture.
That's right. And see, we were at Sarah Lawrence. Ed went to Sarah Lawrence in '45, and none of us had a lot of money. But what we would do would be have dinners. Lots of spaghetti, inexpensive dinners, and we'd sit around and discuss McCarthy. You remember the terrible McCarthy man? Yeah. Or whatever, for hours until 12 o'clock, and drinking a lot. Sometimes beer, sometimes wine, and rarely hard liquor because we couldn't afford it, Well, but we all drank too much, I tell you that.
Pauline is a hard drinker, too.
Yeah.
And it took me, even in adulthood, it took a real jog of somebody to show it to me that in fact what I was watching in terms of behavior, they said, oh, well, she's had too much to drink, and all of a sudden it just snapped. I said, oh, of course.
Yeah.
I'm still back into being the child who was not quite sure why are they behaving this way, kind of stuff. Well, no, we were trying to pinpoint when it happened. It probably was just part of the culture, and it just stayed with her because they became serious drinkers.
Yeah.
Serious, really heavy.
Well, now, when you were married, she and Ed Morrow were married again. Because they say they were married in 51.
Right.
And you weren't married until...
68.
Yeah. So they were married and living in Argentina. No, Andy was down in Argentina. He was the one who got up for the wedding in time, wasn't he?
He was in South America.
Yeah.
In Ecuador or someplace, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You still see him? What's happened to those two? Andy and
Andy is now 56. He's going to be 56 at the end of this month. And he and his wife have a bookstore for now about 20 years in Manchester Center, Vermont.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they came back from working for Care Packages.
Uh-huh.
And he worked in Wall Street with his father-in-law for a couple of years. He lived in Croton. And then decided to open up a bookstore, which he did up in Manchester Center, and he became extremely successful. He has one of the best bookstores in the country, known as one of the best bookstores in the country. He has something like 30 employees.
Oh, that's a lot for a bookstore.
He became head of the New England Booksellers Association, then head of the American Booksellers Association. He's a big wig in the booksellers business. And last year he had open heart surgery.
Oh, my.
Ed Morrow died at age 52 with a whole bunch of different complications. One of them has to do with the heart. And Laney stopped smoking on that day. And he has changed his life. He doesn't eat any meat or any fat anymore, and he's very rigorous about his exercising. He's a very tall, slender man, very intense.
Andy, this is.
Yeah, very closed with his emotions, very difficult for him to communicate feelings. Very bright, very meticulous and precision-oriented and driven.
Mm-hmm.
And he married a very assimilated German-Jewish girl from German-Jewish stock from Westchester. They have two sons named Edward Andrew Morrow III and Christopher Morrow. And Edward Andrew Morrow III, who is called Andy, is living now in India, and both the boys are Buddhists. And the older one has been a serious student of Buddhism, and they both went to Oberlin. And the older one is still studying in India, has come back and forth several times, and he will probably be teaching Buddhism. He's a little bit out of this world. The younger one is very much of this world, very tall, attractive man who is now who did 3 years in the Peace Corps and is now in graduate school in environmental policy in Michigan, I forget, someplace. Laney got married first. She went to Bridgeport University School of Nursing, married somebody who mother never liked or approved of, and she had two children very quickly. She'd had problems with her reproductive tract and was very concerned about whether she would have children. And she's the one who, you know, the term designated patient.
Designated driver.
No, that's designated is not the one I meant. I forgot the psychological term. Designate. I forgot the term. In a family, there'll be one person who gets sort of scapegoated.
Yeah.
And the person who will, if there are problems with the family, that's the one who's going to get sent to see a doctor. Whereas, in fact, it may be the parents who should be in therapy.
Yeah. Laney was always the one that had something wrong, huh?
Well, she's the one who's got the brunt of everything. And she's struggled really hard to prove herself, and she's accomplished a tremendous amount. She's very conservative and staid and real middle American in many, many ways. She's it's curious because she struggles with this image of mother as a cosmopolitan kind of person, and the family is all these international sets, speaking languages and everything, and being academically very sharp, and she just isn't. And she's got a very serious inferiority complex that was really contributed to by the adults in the family. She was, Ed used to call her my ugly duckling. She never used to be able to play word games as well as everybody else.
That's a shame.
And, but the fact is, she's the one who got her master's in nursing on her own, really on her own, raising 2 kids, having tremendous financial difficulty, and her husband sick with a lot of illnesses and stuff, and she got divorced. I forget what year. I can't remember.
Now, where's she living now?
And she's living in Connecticut. She's got a nice big house. She's remarried, again, I can't remember when exactly, 1975, I think. A nice, peaceable man who doesn't make a tremendous impression one way or the other, but they're good, happy together. And she's the head of a visiting nurses association for Ridgefield, Connecticut. She's got a very high status job in her industry, and she's well paid and very well seen. So she's made it.
So bless her heart.
Yeah, and Andy has made it. But Andy's made it and can't figure out why he's not happy, and he's back in therapy, working hard at it this time. And I'm the gypsy. I'm the one who goes all over the place, accumulates no wealth, no property, no stocks and bonds.
Time, aren't you?
And I've had lots of difficult years, but I'm the one who gathers adventures and experiences, and does family research.
No. Well, did they talk to you freely about the days when before you came along, when it was just Jane and Ed and the 2 children?
Yeah, no, they don't have very solid memories. Once I do more of my interviewing with adults who remember the period, I'll be able to give them things to talk about, because children have a harder time remembering, you know.
Yeah.
So if I say to them, no, this is what was happening at that time, do you remember such and such? That'll help them. Yeah. Andy seems very reticent. There's a lot of anger at his parents, and he's working on it. Lainey is furious at Mother, and probably both of them. She loves. I mean, it's not to say that there's not love too, but there's tremendous.
How does Lainey look now? I never thought she looked like Ed or Jane. She used to be tow-headed, right?
What's tow-headed?
Almost.
Blonde?
Yeah, very. It's whiter than blonde. It's almost.
Well, she's 51 now, so it's gray.
Yeah, okay.
She's very tall. She's 5'11", and Andy's 6'2" or something. I mean, they're tall people. She's big-boned woman.
No, see, I remember as a little girl. I guess if you say she's 51 now, and I'm thinking of God. She was just a child, because the war's over 50 years, and this was during the war. So she was barely born. But my image of her is as a little girl, like 5 or 6 years old, with lanky tow hair.
Well, she for a while there, she was as tall as her brother for a long time. It was embarrassing to him because she was very tall.
Taller than Andy. Tall as.
Tall as him, and he's 5 years older than she is.
Yeah.
And she has 2 very tall, large boys. Oh, she has 2 boys too, and they both live in California now. And one of them is a locksmith, a very bright man who has a lot of natural brightness, but this is what he does. And the other one is very straight, just like his mother, even much straighter than his mother. And he works for a company, and he's going back to get his engineering degree and all this kind of stuff. And they're all voting Republican. So does Lainey.
Yeah. Well, I'm voting Republican these days.
Well, these are, you know, Jane and Ed and Sioma. So I mean, these are real left-wing liberal Democrats most of the time.
I was a liberal Democrat then, but I changed my ways about 6, 7 years ago. I just got fed up with the Democrats.
Okay, but this is I'm just trying to give you a shorthand of where they are. She's really middle American, says really goofy kind of language that is this, like, I love her dearly. I mean, she is a wonderful, wonderful sister. We are coming back from Israel. Has given us a chance to be really close.
Yeah.
And we
How
have...
long were you over there, Janie?
9 years.
Yeah.
And
then the girls have gone back, haven't they?
Sarah went back. She did a year and a half of college, and the Israeli army kept writing to her that she was supposed to be serving, so she went. She just finished now, and she's applying to art schools in Jerusalem. And she has a live-in boyfriend that I'm not crazy about, but that's it. And the other one went through a very difficult transition and a very, very difficult adolescent and really needed to be in a boarding school where, in fact, she's doing very well now that she's in the boarding school. Now she wants to come back home, but we're telling her she has to finish where she is.
How old is she now?
She's 16, and she went back to Israel because that was the only boarding school that Larry would pay for. And I couldn't afford to pay for one here in the States. So, in fact, I've in many ways duplicated a lot of my mother's travels, international travels, jolts and dashes across the globe, and in fact, and as well, the having an empty nest of all my children suddenly. Well, it wasn't so sudden for her, but my leaving her house earlier than is the usual pattern.
That's right.
It was in fact what happened with Rachel.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to observe the parallels that happen.
Yes.
I had a very rough marriage with Larry. He was a violent person.
No, I didn't realize that.
Physically, well, I don't think anybody realizes these things. I mean, what do we know about each other, for heaven's sakes? He was really nasty. He was cruel. And I did not know that that's not the way it is, and it can be otherwise. And I was very, I didn't feel that I had my family behind me, that I could go to one of them and say, I made a mistake, help me. That they would be full of recriminations rather than of support. That was the feeling that I'd gotten from both my parents. And I also did not have personal experience that told me that a marriage can be something better than this. So I stayed with it, and it doesn't say very much for me, but this is where I was in terms of my own personal development.
Yeah.
I stayed married for 13 years, and then finally, how can I say to you, I looked in the mirror and I couldn't even recognize myself. I imagined, in fact, that I had a cancer growing. That's how I felt about myself. And it had to do, I think, and I decided I had to leave him. And by this time I was already living in Jerusalem with him. And I had not finished architecture school. I'd gone to become a bookbinder. I didn't have a ways of supporting myself. And I'd gotten into Princeton School of Architecture, and he'd just gotten a teaching fellowship at Harvard. And I didn't have the self-confidence in myself to say, listen, you got a job at Harvard, you can get one anywhere. Come, let's go to New Jersey for a couple of years, let me get my degree. I just let it go. And we went his way, which is, what happens to lots of women.
Bookbinding up there, right?
Yeah, I did. I was doing bookbinding in Cambridge, and then I did it in Jerusalem, but this was not a way to earn a living. So I moved to the kibbutz. I had cousins who lived on the kibbutz, and I moved there, and it was there on my own that I sort of started to grow up a little bit. And I was sophisticated, but I wasn't mature, and it took me a long time to get there. And I learned a lot about myself, about my own strengths, there when I was working and living on the kibbutz. And there I stupidly married somebody. It was just out of loneliness, and I wanted somebody for my girls. He was very sweet with them, but he was a nothing, really. Really nothing. This was not a man who was going to hurt me.
No.
He was more like a dish rag. And I had already planned to go back to America. And he came along with...
Is His name was Dove or something.
Yeah, and that didn't help either. That was really hard. And it was a really catastrophic re-entry into the United States. It was financially disastrous.
Uh-huh.
And the only, by the way, the thing that made the divorce possible for me really was the fact that my mother had died and left me some money.
Oh.
Which meant that I could go on my own a little bit and not feel scared that I was really dependent on Larry. So here I had some money now. I could be free a little bit to go off on my own. And so ironically, it was Jane who was able to give me the means to be able to release myself.
Wonderful.
And I came back to the States, still using Jane's money that I'd left invested someplace. And I ended up buying a little house in an expensive neighborhood at the wrong time, thinking I could fix it up and sell it. And I lost $20,000 on that house.
I'm not surprised. Everybody lost money in those days.
That was Mr. Bush.
Yeah.
And we split up, Dove and I, and Rachel was going through this awful, well, it was not only because her alone. I mean, everything that around us was making it difficult for her too. Her stepfather and I splitting up, the fact that her father came back to live in New York as a representative of the Hebrew University for their School of Overseas Students. She was experiencing for the first time her two dysfunctional parents together, and making use of the divorce situation that she'd never had an opportunity to play with, to play one off against the other. And she's a tremendously bright and vivacious and loving and warm person whose emotions are very on the surface, and they bounced around just too much. And we also were in a very wealthy neighborhood, and she felt poor. And she hit puberty about a year before anybody else, and she's extremely beautiful. I mean, like, people turn around the street to look at her. All this just played a real number on her.
I'm sure.
And she ended up having a breakdown.
Oh, poor dear.
And she was in a hospital for 3 weeks. And unable to go back to the school where she'd come from because she was had become ostracized, from being the most popular to being ostracized, and she couldn't go back there. And Larry did not help, because we'd never really worked at finding a way to function together in terms of caring for the children. He had backed out entirely. The entire relationship was with his new wife and me. He never played a part in it, except to scream at me obscenities and stuff. I mean, he was really awful. Screaming outside my house, "Your mother's a whore." You know, all really awful. A terrible, terrible.
Where is he now? Is he back in Jerusalem?
Yeah, he teaches at the Hebrew University. And that's it. Meanwhile, actually, the move for the girls have been good because they've gotten to know him. Spend some time with their father, instead of just seeing him at a distance and fearing him or picking up whatever I intentionally or unintentionally have let them know about him. They've developed their own relationship with him, which is, well, girls need that.
Yes, they do.
Teenage girls, they need that. How are they gonna take the next step into womanhood? And so I thought that was interesting. That in fact there's another parallel. I went off to live with my father for my teenage years.
That's right.
And Rachel's doing the same thing. I don't think all of this stuff is accidental. I think it all goes into play somehow.
Yes.
And I think that Sarah has chosen a husband that's very much like Larry, a boyfriend. She lives with him. He's very, I think he's a little abusive of her. She was very strong-minded and attention-getting in terms. People love to be with her. She's become docile and servile.
Well, that's too bad.
Yeah, it just drives me nuts, and you can't do anything about it.
No. It'll work itself out some way, either good or bad, love.
That's it.
You can't change too much. I mean, they have to do.
I decided to put my thoughts on the record. I told her I don't. She confided in me some things, and I told her I don't think this is the way you're handling this. This is not a good relationship. If you want this to be a good relationship, you have to change the way you're acting with him.
Yeah.
To keep your personality and not to lose yourself into nothingness through him. And what she does with that is, I'm afraid, not anything I can control anymore.
No, especially at that distance.
No. So I think, so that's that. I've caught you up on everybody.
Well, I'm glad to hear all this because I've always been very fond of you, Janie, and I wish you well on this project. I think you're very courageous to undertake it because they were both very complicated people.
Complicated.
Yeah, complicated. There was nothing simple or easily understood about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very good phrase to end with.
All right, dear. I enjoyed talking to you.
And may I call you again if I want to check on some other stuff?
If somebody gives you a clue that maybe I could add something to, I'll be happy to talk.
Okay. And would you like me to help you to, well, you don't really need my help. Why don't you do the same thing for Gray and for your grandchildren?
For my family?
Yeah, why don't you just talk into a tape and tell them things?
I could do that. Yeah. Well, then how are you going to get it transcribed? You don't have one of those fabulous machines that'll take it up and type it from the voice, do you?
Oh, is there such a thing?
I don't know.
No, I'm just going to, this is not for court records, for heaven's sake.
No, you just listen to get
I listen again, and I
and then you're eventually going to sit down and write it.
Yeah.
That'd be wonderful. I'd love to see the...
Would you like a copy of these tapes?
Yeah, if it's not too complicated, because if I hear what I've said, it might spark other things that would be of interest, or I might correct things that I've got wrong, you know.
Okay. I will. I'll send you a copy.
All right. That'd be fine.
Take good care of yourself.
All right,
and I'll
dear.
Speak to you again soon.
Yeah, and come down. Well, are you ever going to come down and, you said you knew the Ellis...
Yeah, I met them at this Ellis reunion.
Uh-huh. But I don't know how well they knew your mother. All I know is that they were relatives.
Right. Well, we talked about that for hours on end over there. So that was good.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, I enjoyed talking, Janie. Call me if I can help.
Okay. Take care, Helen. Bye-bye.
Bye.